Now, on Thursday this week, the National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich will table the national budget estimates on the floor of the National Assembly. The estimates for the financial year 2018-2019 amounts to 3.075 trillion shillings, which is an increase by about 400 billion shillings from the last national budget of 2.77 trillion shillings. The budget comes on the backdrop of graft cases dogging various government departments, with some already getting a budget cut in return, not to mention the public bloated wage bill and public debt that is way above the recommended ceiling. The budget estimates have also factored in the Big Four agenda that are President Kenyatta's legacy projects as he serves his last term in office. Still, the budget comes at a time that the country is showing signs of an economic rebound after shaking off last year's political risk. So with all these factors at play, is the country ready to fund and spend the all-time high national budget? Right, and for this conversation tonight, I have two economists who will be joining me here in studio. Johnson Jerry will be joining us a little bit later. He is the corporate finance manager at ABC Capital. And I have already in studio with me Ken Gishinga, the chief economist at Mentoria Consulting. But first, I want to bring in our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, who is live at the County Hall here in Nairobi. A very good evening to you, Sophia.
Good evening, Sharon. Thursday it is budget day. A very tight rope that the top economist in the country, that CS Treasury, Henry Rotich, must walk as he tries to balance the needs and the challenges around raising revenue and also the leakages that the country has been witnessing and the high debt. So as you mentioned, 3 trillion budget is what we're going to be seeing in the coming financial year starting next month, 2018-2019. The target of revenue collection is 1.9 trillion. So you can see way below what we will be spending as a country. And if history is to say anything, we have not, or the KRA has not been able to meet the target and as far as revenue collection is concerned. So that 1 trillion, some analysts argue, is wishful thinking and wait to see. But compounding that situation is that 4 trillion in terms of the kind of debt the country finds herself in, bigger than what the country needs to spend and what the country actually has in as far as revenue is concerned. And this coming at a time, Sharon, where the IMF has already raised that red flag. Remember, there's that standby facility that they're offering the country, but has also kept Kenya on her toes to be able to cut down and make sure the situation she finds herself now in is enhanced in as far as getting this debt down and also mitigating on the gaps and differences you've been able to witness. So that on one hand, this budget, what will the extension in as far as expanding the tax bracket, because we've been hearing talk of that, to be able to get more money to allow for spending, but also some of the situations that make that scenario bad for the country is the corruption, the country reeling from scandal after scandal. And in the past, we've reported at least a third of that budget goes to corruption. And so it's not a huge concern about how money will be spent, is that whether it will be spent on the things it should be or it will go to a few individuals. And of course, the huge wage bill as well. But tonight, we want to get the insights of a man who's had a tough job with his colleagues in Parliament who have all manner of demands from their constituents, or of course, those around some of the committees and other work they have to do as members of Parliament. He's the budget chairman in the National Assembly and also the Kikuyu Member of Parliament. I'm talking about Kimani Ichung'wah. Thank you, sir, for making time for us tonight. A lot of concerns around this budget, that we just keep going further and further into turmoil. What do you say to that?
True, as you say, basically just because our resources are limited, but our needs are unlimited. And actually, as you've rightly said, those who are watching the ongoings in the National Assembly this afternoon have witnessed the kind of pressure that we have to go through with people who have unlimited needs, demanding for more and more. The decision that the Assembly has just made a few minutes ago to increase the national deficit by a further 9.2 billion shillings, I do hope is a decision that they will reconsider tomorrow, since we are still continuing with that exercise tomorrow. But the challenges come because we are still developing as a country, and our needs are very many. You had the concerns today have been on the dilapidated roads infrastructure as a result of the rains, and I really want to continue to plead with my colleagues in the National Assembly to understand the position where both the executive and those of us in the budget committee are coming from, in terms of being able to provide the resources that we have in a limited way, and also getting more resources, especially on roads infrastructure from donors.
But is the concern here then limited needs? Because needs will be there, and Kenyans are contributing through taxes to be able to have service delivered to them? Or is it the missteps as far as priority areas are concerned? For instance, NYS, a lot of money, all of a sudden from 5 billion to 25 billion is put in. Look at where we are now. You have to slash back. What informed those kind of decisions in the past?
Let me say we have made mistakes in the past. That must be said. We have made mistakes. We have also not, even as an assembly, as a parliament, not been very keen on how government implements the budgets that we give to various ministries and departments and agencies. And that's why consciously, out of what we have learned from the past, that you appropriate so much money to a department, you don't follow up in the course of the year during implementation on how that money is being utilized. We tend to wait as a country until after the effects, after the scandals have been hit. That's when Public Accounts, Public Investments Committees of the House will move in. But we are saying, beginning this coming financial year, we want all departmental committees, the money they appropriate to various ministries, departments, and agencies of government, to be able to get reports on a quarterly basis in terms of implementation of that budget, and be able to follow up, monitor, and evaluate whether that money is actually being utilized for the intended purpose. So that, for us as a Budget and Appropriations Committee, and we intend to actualize that. What is not being utilized as was meant to be, then we take it back and take it to those more deserving areas and other priorities.
Yeah. We're talking about corruption taking a third of that money, meaning if it was not leaking, if it was not being stolen, it would be going to service delivery. So some are concerned with the budgetary allocation to the DPP, to the EACC, that these are the people that have been put in place, the officers that should be fighting corruption. The judiciary has been slashed as well. PSC is getting 12 billion. Judiciary of over 8,000 employees is getting 14 billion. So PSC with 200 employees, and still Parliament gets 20 billion. How are we getting these priorities, sir?
I think when you talk about budget cuts, you must look at cuts across the board. It's not true that it's only the judiciary that has lost money in terms of being cut during this budget making process. Parliament has indeed lost a lot of money. Even the estimates we are considering now, we are cutting a further 750 million shillings from Parliament, over and above what had been cut earlier. Therefore, cuts are across the board, both in government, in the legislature, and also the other arm of government in the judiciary. In terms of what we have been able to give to DPP, EACC, yes, we have allocated more resources to DCC, DPP, also DCI. We have allocated, I think, a further 100 million shillings. DPP, of course, to be able to build their capacity. I think they are doing some good work in terms of the fight against corruption. And we cannot just be talking about the fight against corruption and not putting resources into it. We have therefore enhanced their budgets to be able to help them in that fight against corruption. The DPP, I think, most of that money is going towards building capacity and being even able to recruit more staff to be able to support the fight against corruption and be able to prosecute these cases and gather evidence quick enough to be able to charge people in court. In terms of...
what justifies the PSC getting so much money?
Well, every department, both Parliament, because PSC, again, as you said, it's not just the 200 staff, members of staff under PSC, and I think actually there are more than 200. Remember, it's a budget that also caters for members of Parliament, both development and recurrent. If you look at that budget, there is also a development budget, I think, of about 2.6 billion shillings for the completion of this tower here. And Parliament is indeed indeed incurring, I can tell you for a fact, last month, the month of May, during the budget-making process, because we are in that inadequate rooms, there are people who had to hold their committee meetings, including calling cabinet ministers and department agencies of government. They are represented into hotels in town because there wasn't enough room. Therefore, we have prioritized the completion of this building under the Parliamentary Service Commission.
Yeah.
And therefore, I don't know why we always dwell on the Parliamentary Service Commission vis-a-vis what is going to the executive. And most of the corruption that you're talking about is not in Parliament, is in the executive. And you must give credit to where it's due. Parliament, at least this time around during this budget-making process, has taken measures to also make sure that those who misappropriate money are not allocated more money. Case in point is what we mentioned, the National Youth Service. We were able to cut at least 4.25 billion shillings from their budget. The proposal initially was to cut about 8.7 billion shillings, 8.25 billion shillings. We have since reviewed that. Those are some of the things that we'll be handling tomorrow to at least be able to just maintain the young men and women who are recruits at NYS in the program without necessarily hurting them because of issues that happen there. Issues that were not mistakes of those children. Yeah.
Let's talk about ordinary mwananchi, bread, maize flour. There's talk that bracket, and as far as collection of tax, is about to expand to also the informal sector that has largely remained untapped. What do you say to that? Because that's going to have maybe a ripple effect as opposed to what is just getting more money.
I think we'll wait until Thursday, Sophia, when CS Rotich gives his budget highlights on revenue-raising measures, because that's when we really get to know as a house how does Treasury or the National Treasury intend to raise money to finance this budget. Of course, we must also admit that as a country we have really never really expanded our tax base. And we have a choice to make whether to expand our tax base and be able to collect more taxes from a little bit more people, or be able to collect more from you who's working and earning a good salary. Therefore, it's a choice that Kenyans have to make, whether you collect much more from those who are already paying, or do we expand our tax base to be able to collect much more from more people without really hurting a select number of people. Because the option is you either expand the tax base or you come and get more from you and me.
Yeah. Other than corruption that is really choking the money that Kenya gets to receive, the wage bill, half of the money is going to pay 2% of the population, yourselves and others in public service. And it's a problem not only at the national government, but also at the county governments. What must Kenya do to streamline the workforce so that most of what we're getting is not just going to salaries, allowances, eating allowances?
Definitely, when you talk about sitting allowances, you're talking about Parliament. And I'll tell you for a fact, Parliament had requested for about 822 million shillings to recruit more staff. And we declined that as a Budget and Appropriations Committee, because we said, in line with what everybody else is doing in government, that we have declined additional hiring of staff other than those very critical areas that, like DPP, that are truly understaffed. We have asked everybody else in government to be able to rationalize what the staff levels they have, because within the budget ceilings they have, they can be able to recruit in the critical areas. And that's what we told in Parliament. For the very critical areas, people like teachers, we have this afternoon increased the budget for TVETA, the Technical and Vocational Training Authority, their budget to be able to recruit an additional 2,000 teachers for the TTIs, the Technical Training Institutes that have been established across the board. And those are critical areas that really we must hire.
When you're talking about recruiting, I'm talking about already it's bad as it is. We have too many people. So how do we reduce the numbers we have?
Those are painful decisions, again, that we have to make as a country. Between now and the next financial year, we must really say, when we talk about staff rationalization, is a fancy way of saying really that we have to look at areas that we may need to retrench people. And if we have to, it's a decision that we have to make as a country, because we cannot continue having a bloated workforce. And really, as you've said, even right in the county governments, we seconded staff to county governments. Every governor who walks into office after every election comes in with their own staff, hires new people without regard to what was there before. Therefore, it's an issue that we have to look into, and I hope the Public Service the ministry in charge of public service under CS Kobia, is a matter that they are looking into, that what are the optimal staffing levels for each of our government departments, ministries and agencies, to make sure that we only maintain staff that we need, not just having bloated workforces.
Okay. The projects that the government has focused on, even in the last administration and the last term of President Kenyatta, have been rather capital intensive, and hence the huge borrowing and leaving us in the space we find ourselves in. In hindsight, do you think it was a mistake? Should we have gone slow on some of these very capital intensive projects that get us in the red?
It can never be a mistake. It can never be a mistake to borrow money to put into productive use. It can only be a mistake if we borrow money and put in recurrent expenditure, or probably...
Which we are doing now a little bit.
No. We and I can tell you that as Chairman Budget and Appropriations Committee, we do not put money into recurrent expenditure, money that is borrowed. What is borrowed is going into, and we have made tasked the National Treasury and all ministries that indeed for every coin you borrow, you must show us the project that that money is going to finance. And therefore, we made sure that all the money that we are borrowing will go towards financing of productive sectors in terms of areas that will be of benefit economically to the country. And there's nothing bad with borrowing, so long as you're putting that money into productive use. Money that will go into areas that will be able to generate more money and grow our economy, be able to provide job opportunities for our young people who don't have jobs. And it is those productive activities that drive our economy to grow. Therefore, even on hindsight, ask me if we need to borrow again. Yes, we should borrow, because we don't have, I said, we have unlimited needs with limited resources. We must borrow. Question is, what do you do with what you borrow?
That is worrying. We should borrow at 4 trillion and 3 trillion budget and 4 trillion debt.
I'll tell you what we are borrowing this year is about 576 billion shillings, both domestic and foreign borrowing. Okay. So it's not the figures you talk about, 3 trillion against collections of 1.9 trillion. Remember, the 3 trillion also includes donor funds, grants and loans. Okay. Therefore, what we eventually will borrow is about 570 billion shillings, right, both from the domestic market and from outside.
Sawa. Thank you very much for your time. Kimani Ichung'wah, Budget Chairman, National Assembly, and also Kikuyu Member of Parliament, Sharon.
Pia Wanuna there, and also just giving us that picture from that legislative point of view, and asking very important questions, which I shall also be having from an economic expert point of view. In studio, just in a bit, I will be engaging Ken Gishinga, who is the Chief Economist at Mentoria Consulting. I'll also have with me in studio Johnson Derry, who's the Corporate Finance Manager at ABC Capital. But before we get into that, let's now just quickly turn to the numbers and how they have been distributed in the budget estimates. And if you just look at the overall budget estimate for the financial year 2018-2019, we are looking at about 3 trillion Kenya shillings. This compared to what we had for the financial year 2017-2018, that stood at 2.77 trillion Kenya shillings. And out of this, let's just take a look at how we performed, or just looking at revenue collection for the last financial year, ordinary revenue collection, that is. We got 1.1 trillion shillings the year 2017-18 against what is estimated in this coming year at 1.74 trillion shillings. So a big increase, rather relatively big increase in terms of the overall budget, I beg your pardon, against, a very, very small increase in terms of revenue collection. And let's just take a look at how this budget is estimated to be spread. And you'd remember that the CS Treasury has said that, this will be really distributed around the Big Four agenda by the Jubilee, that the Jubilee administration is prioritizing on. And on universal healthcare, we are seeing 389.76 million shillings rollout, and against a support of 1.1 billion shillings. Let's also take a look at another board on food security, and the National Expanded Irrigation Program is expected to have an allocation of 2.36 billion shillings, and fertilizer subsidy program 4.3 billion shilling. The other area, one of the big four, agenda manufacturing, on the development of SEZ Textile Park in Naivasha, allocation of 2 billion shillings, and for the development of leather industrial park, we have 800 million shillings. Just taking a look at some of those estimates in the budget estimates. And just taking a look at the last board there in manufacturing, construction of SMEs, we have 1 billion Kenya shillings estimated for that, and fisheries, aquaculture, and the blue economy getting 2.2 billion shillings. Right. Let's now just get into that conversation in studio. We are seeing that is generally where the numbers, how the numbers have been distributed. And joining me in studio, as I've introduced to you before, is Ken Gishinga, the Chief Economist at Mentoria Consulting, and John Sonderi, who's the Corporate Finance Manager at ABC Capital. Many thanks, gentlemen, for joining me for this conversation. I just want to start with you, Mr. Gishinga, just to get your view from an economist's point of view of what you take of this budget estimates and how the areas where they have been prioritized upon.
Thank you, Sharon. Let me first start by saying that the budget making process is the opportunity that every country has to really understand where it's putting its money and where it's getting value for where it's putting its money. And for the longest time, this country has always ran a deficit, meaning that we always spend more than we earn as a country. So that's always the biggest concern. And the biggest conversation is, can this country ever get to run a budget surplus? Can we ever collect more revenue than we are spending? And I think that should always be the philosophy of any good budget maker. That said, just listening to the conversation you had earlier on with the MP out there, it seems that the country has to make some painful decisions around the wage bill, decisions around the national budget, decisions around revenue collection. And I don't think those will be very easy decisions, but it's something that we have to really think through if you're going to hit Vision 2030.
Right, and I just want to stay with you that we are always running on a deficit and never a surplus. What, in your opinion, are some of the hindrances? Why has this always constantly be a problem? And it seems that right now we are actually in a worse place in terms of the kind of revenue we have vis-a-vis the amount of money we need to spend.
Well, it's really a cocktail of many issues, some historical, some present. I think issues around land tax, for example, is something this country has never really been able to get going. And in many countries, property taxes are really what drives the budget agenda. If you look at Nairobi alone, we don't raise enough property tax to raise revenue in Nairobi County alone. So I think some of these issues around idle land, idle assets, is probably one of the reasons that we've never really been able to run surpluses, such as countries like South Korea, where they run a major surplus and they even return money back to the citizenry. And I think we really need to aspire to be where those Asian tigers are.
Right, and let me bring in Mr. Nderi on just the same. Gishinga is talking about how we need to aspire to have, for once, have a surplus and not always running on a deficit. Is this a dream that we can achieve?
Well, we can, and it has been achieved before. I think under Kibaki's first term, we did run budget surpluses. For me, I don't think we have a problem with tax collection, really. For countries, of our level, our development level, I think we're collecting quite a bit in form of taxation. I think the problem is in spending. I think we have been too ambitious in what we want to achieve, given our resources. I think we need to rethink how relearn how economies develop, how they grow, because ultimately what we're trying to figure out as a country is how to get the ordinary person's welfare to improve, not to raise as much tax revenue as possible for the government. So it is from that perspective that if we are looking to improve the welfare of the average person, then what is the best method going forward? And that's a conversation I think that we need to be having because I think the model that has been used for most of the administrations we've been having in Kenya is one where the thinking has been government is the primary driver of the country's welfare, and I think that is a wrong way to look at it. I think we need to take a bit of more responsibility with the individuals, and of course if we are going to look at it from an industry perspective or the economic perspective, we need to give the driver, which I think is the private sector, or at least allow it more resources to allow it to do what it does best, which is to produce wealth.
Right. And let me bring in Mr. Gishinga on the same. A question that we saw Sophia even posing to the legislator, that do you think our government has really focused on very capital-intensive projects as opposed to the welfare of the masses? And is that a wrong approach?
Well, it's hard to say whether it's a right or wrong approach. You actually need both.
Right.
The standard gauge railway, for example, is a very capital-intensive project. What it does is it creates an economic multiplier for the rest of the economy, meaning you can transport goods, you can transport people faster at a cheaper cost. So any country, African countries have a major infrastructure gap, I think to the tune of almost $100 billion. And for the next 10 years, the big focus, not just in Kenya, but in Africa, is going to be how do we get infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the airports, the shipping ports, how do we get these infrastructure tools to be at a world-class standard? Now, those are, as you say, very capital-intensive projects, but they do have social spillovers because you end up creating jobs for the local communities. For example, at the Lamu port, they're hiring a lot of the youth from the Lamu area and such. So you really can't disconnect the labor part of the question and the capital part. You really do need both investments. Right.
And Mr. Nderi, just looking at the estimates of this 2018-2019 budget, indicating that we're going to raise 1.7 trillion in ordinary revenue, and we have to repay a debt of 870 billion shillings in this particular financial year. Then out of that, from what we would have collected from ordinary revenue, we're left with about 900 billion shillings. So if we look at recurrent expenditure, even before going into all these development projects, it seems that there's nothing left. Is this a concern?
Of course it's a concern. It's been a concern for a long time. I think we had identified it even as early as Kibaki's second term, where I think the train left the rails. Now, I'm one of those people who don't believe that in the concept of the infrastructure gap. I think economics 101, resources are limited, so you cut your cloth according to your coat. I mean, you cut your coat according to your cloth. The way you do it is you get around the infrastructure hurdles within your ingenuity, or with you cope. You find a way to cope. But what has happened with our infrastructure spending is that we have now crystallized a cost that could have probably been managed by ingenuity. Now we've crystallized it in taxation now. So if you look at the SGR, for example, probably one of the biggest drivers of our debt. And the problem with debt is that it grows exponentially as interest keeps on building on principal, and you keep capitalizing your principal, and interest keeps building on that. So we need to review how we think we need to grow, because ideally, ultimately, growth ought to come from the factories, not from the infrastructure itself. Infrastructure is just an enabler. So if your enabler is increasing your cost of doing business, then you need to rethink how you're doing things.
Right, and I love this conversation. Very different perspectives on the models of approach for economic growth in the country. And we have to take a short break now here on The Big Story, but don't go too far. We have much more to talk about regarding the budget estimates for this financial year. So don't go too far. We'll be back after this short break.